Hello and welcome to another episode of Purple Tories. Today I'm very excited because I have a very special guest, and that is Charles Amos, who is Councillor of East Grinstead and also recently become the president of the Conservative Society at King's College London. There's been a bit of press about you in the tablet the tab about you recently becoming KCL president. What have you made of the response to that, and how do you feel about the piece in general?
The piece was very well researched and very informative, and therefore I would commend the journalists for looking into my background so well. They've done a good job of that. As journalists, they're doing their job well. To be quite honest, I don't have as much of an issue with it as other people do. They took down my views. They asked me to clarify views that I held 5 years ago. So on the whole, I thought it was a very accurate piece, and they're not wrong in saying I was previously a member of UKIP. I perhaps wouldn't have chosen the headline UKIP poster boy becomes president of KCL Conservatives, but then that was a decision that they took, probably in regards to maximising the number of views on their site.
Yeah, I think maybe some people were a bit suspicious because I think the tab, I personally have never read the tab before reading about you, but I think they've been known to have done a few hit pieces on certain right-leaning people in the past, but I couldn't say either way, to be honest. I don't know if you know more about this.
I haven't read the tab before.
Right, okay.
No, I can't.
So going into your election as president of KCL Conservative Society, when was the exact date of this election, can I ask?
It was the 26th of March.
Okay, so this would have been during the coronavirus, wouldn't it?
Well, yes, insofar as everything in the last few months has involved the coronavirus, but yes.
So how did you vote in that election? Was it online?
Well, yes, it was online. The whole election was online. There was no physical husting, which was rather unfortunate because I like the idea of debating with my colleague Philip. But nonetheless, I think in the end that probably benefited me because I was able to use my information more effectively than my opponent was able to, because I've been collecting data since January, and I believe he had only started collecting data in late February, March. So I had the advantage in an online election, and it was close. So I think it was very important. It was integral to my election that I was, or rather had started, campaigning in January.
Do you know the exact result or close enough to it?
It was 2017 to me.
2017.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's a pretty good result. So being former UKIP, I have to say you're kind of like the perfect guest for my show, because we've had former KIPers and we've had the odd Tory come on the show, but we've never had someone who's been in UKIP and then full-heartedly said, I support the Conservative Party. Is that very much where you're at? I know you don't agree with everything the Conservative Party say, but on the whole, you are a supporter.
I am a supporter of the Conservative Party because I see it as the best vehicle electorally to put in place Conservative policies, especially given the first past the post system. Am I a wholehearted supporter of all of their policies? No, certainly not. I think Boris Johnson has got Brexit right, or he appears to have got Brexit right so far, particularly with not asking for an extension to our transition period. But on virtually every other issue, I would have to disagree with the Boris Johnson administration. I actually find that I'm rather sentimental about the David Cameron era of conservatism, because at least he spoke about austerity and to a limited extent actually meant it. Boris Johnson has given up on any idea of balancing the books whatsoever now, and he'll use coronavirus as an excuse not to balance the books even more, and he'll kick it into the long grass, the idea of running a surplus.
So you must be referring to the things such as HS2 still going ahead despite coronavirus and things like this.
Absolutely, absolutely. The initial forecast for the cost of HS2 was £56 billion, and now it's forecast to come in at over £100 billion. HS2 is an absurd project, and I've been against that since, well, ever since I became aware of the project in 2014.
Okay. So as well as describing yourself as a conservative, you also describe yourself as very much a libertarian and also a strong supporter of Thatcher. Do you want to talk about why you think Thatcher was... do you think she was possibly the greatest conservative leader? I know a lot of people do. In recent times.
In recent times, certain. There has been no better prime minister than Margaret Thatcher since 1945. When you're comparing Victorians,
so why do you think that is?
Why was she great? Did you say?
Yeah. Why do you think she was the greatest in recent times?
Because she put forward an ideology of classical liberalism and was not afraid to state that she believed in freedom, and particularly economic freedom. Her privatization agenda did an enormous amount to reverse the socialism that Clement Attlee put in place post 1945. She didn't succeed on everything. Healthcare spending, welfare spending, education spending actually went up in real terms under her reign. But by the end of her premiership, she had reduced debt to around about 30% of GDP or less in actual fact. And she had privatized large swathes of British industry, which made it immeasurably more productive. And for that, she is to be commended. And that her example is one that the Conservatives should follow into the future.
Did you ever find yourself coming into conflict ever when you were in UKIP with people in UKIP? Because I know in UKIP there were a lot of people who supported not socialism, but a lot of industry to be state-backed, you know, obviously the NHS and things like that. But I'm trying to think, like, you know, I think you'd get like a lot of UKIP supporters who would support nationalising the trains and things like that. So did you ever find yourself coming into conflict there?
I did, actually. I remember going to an IEA event at the spring conference, I believe, in 2016 or 2015 or something like that. And the question was on liberalism or classical liberalism or populism. And one of the members that was there was totally opposed to free trade. And he said, isn't it awful that members of our party are putting forward the idea of free trade with China? It's totally unfair that we could possibly have a free trade deal with China. All of their labor regulations are worse than ours. All of their standards regulations are worse. All of the standards that they produce under are worse. And I just thought, what have I got myself into here? How can people possibly be against free trade, despite the fact UKIP called itself a libertarian party back then, according to its constitution? And I believe it still does call itself a libertarian party, despite the statements that people have come out with since.
But how do you counter that argument of China subsidizing their industry and using basically slave labor? How do you counter that in a way in the libertarian position?
Obviously, I'm against subsidization, even if that is subsidization of Chinese industry. But if the Chinese want to subsidize their steel, for example, and I am aware of the fact that in recent years there's been this whole Port Talbot issue and the Welsh steel industries going under because of Chinese dumping, I would still support free trade with China, because that dumping and that occurs allows for British industry to have access to cheap steel, and that can make all of our products cheaper as a result. And as a result of cheaper products, you have a lower cost of living for most people in this country. And the people that are made unemployed in Wales as a result they will go into other industries because the profits in other industries will go up, and that will allow businessmen and entrepreneurs to come along and set up new firms to take away that profit from the existing firms. And as a result, employment will be provided for them and everybody will be better off. Everybody will be better off apart from the Chinese taxpayer that has to support subsidizing Chinese steel to export into the UK. But then that's not our problem.
Do you think there are certain industries, though, that are vital to the security of the nation, where in this case it is important to protect them and not just let free trade rule over these industries?
No. This is an argument. No, I don't think there is any excuse for protectionism or economic nationalism, as you may want to call it. Milton Friedman, in his book Free to Choose, actually addresses this issue. And he cites the example that many economic nationalists give and say, well, we must maintain the steel industry because if we go to war, then we need a domestic industry that can churn out steel to allow us to build tanks and weapons of varying degrees, of various sorts rather. And he makes the very pertinent point of saying, if that's such an issue, you can just stockpile steel, stockpile a large enough pile of it, and then use that to bridge the gap between you going to war, not having the steel plants, steel foundations, or whatever you want to call them, and building them in time. So the stockpile steel would act as a bridge between not having the steel foundations and having the steel foundations. Yet you wouldn't have any of the costs of inflating all of your domestic prices as a result of putting in place tariffs on Chinese or Indonesian steel.
So presumably, are you in favour of the China's Huawei playing a part in the building of our 5G network?
No, I'm not in favour of that. No, because...
Okay, tell me why that is.
Because the Chinese state is involved in Hawaii, or it is alleged that they're involved in Hawaii. And as a result, I would play it safe with excluding them. And I wouldn't want to alienate the Americans and Trump in particular by going down this route. I'd much rather get a free trade deal with Donald Trump and sacrifice Huawei than allow for Huawei and not get a free trade deal with Donald Trump.
Oh, so you're saying that in regards to having better trade as opposed to for security reasons, or is there a security element?
I'd say both are valid objections.
Oh, both.
Both.
So you are in favour of certain not industries as such, but certain decisions when it comes to free trade where you have to have some kind of provisions in place for security.
I suppose so. You've got me.
I've got you.
You've got me.
Yeah. Okay. So, wow, we're getting a lot of comments in this stream already. I'm quite surprised. I'll definitely move to questions soon if I can. I wanted to address your views on immigration because I know that's a subject which a lot of conservatives are interested in. How do you feel about immigration as it is currently, and where would you like it to go?
I would like to see net migration reduced down to below 50,000. I would stick to the old UK policy in this regard.
Was it 50,000 for the old UKIP policy?
I think, when I was in UKIP in 2015, I think it was 30 to 50,000 was the target that they were aiming for. Yes.
Yeah. Well, in my group, Purple Tories on the banner, I actually say as one of the things we support is reducing immigration to the tens of thousands. And the reason why I don't say, like a lot lower number, like 20,000, because I know a lot of people would support that, or just, none at all, just total net zero, is because I think we have to be realistic. And if you were to bring in a government straight away and they just did that so quickly, straight to zero, it would be so damaging, I think, for the economy. It would have to be more of a progression to get to that point.
So I wouldn't want to see net migration brought down to that figure immediately. I don't think that is viable because businesses do need to adapt. And I think your 100,000, tens of thousands pledge does have much merit to it. But ideally, I would like to see immigration reduced down to a more sustainable level, given the current statist apparatus that we have in place in British society. That is the state controlling so much of the economy.
Well, David Cameron did actually famously commit to reducing migration to the tens of thousands, but obviously failed in that project. Why do you think that was?
Because we were a member of the European Union, and he couldn't have possibly delivered on that pledge, because free movement allowed for net migration to be as high as immigrants in the EU wanted it to be. He should have never made that promise, because he could have never delivered on it other than by cutting non-EU migration dramatically.
Do you have any hope now that we have Priti Patel as Home Secretary, who's quite famous for being quite right-wing in her Conservative career? Do you think she might actually do something proper there?
No, I don't think she will do much, because even if she is committed to reducing net migration, I think Boris Johnson and the other wets in the cabinet will stop her from achieving that goal.
Okay, see, what you're saying there is really interesting, because you're criticising the Conservative government in a big way, and yet you're saying, nope, I'm a Conservative supporter and I'll campaign for them no matter what. A lot of people who I am trying to bring with me here or talk to, they can't square those two things together. How can you be so passionate about the Conservative Party when there's people at the top who aren't, with our goals essentially? So how do you square that?
I'm not passionate about the Conservative Party. I simply see it as the most effective vehicle to realise the ends of liberty. It's as basic as that. I mean, there are a number of people within the Conservative Party that I think would be good if they were promoted to higher positions. I mean, Priti Patel, she could be promoted to an even higher position than she is today. That would be fantastic. Steve Baker, I would love to see him in the position of Chancellor. Peter Bone, Philip Davies.
Jacob Rees-Mogg,
he would make a fantastic Chancellor also. All of these individuals within the party on the right-wing end would be fantastic if appointed to the cabinet and allowed to actually implement the agenda that they believe in. I mean, I think it's unbelievable that you've got Dominic Raab and Priti Patel in two of the great offices of state, and yet they're implementing an economic agenda that they would totally disagree with under any normal circumstances if they were backbenchers. It must be the appeal of being able to implement Brexit that has allowed them to join the cabinet and preach the Johnsonite agenda that has been put forward by himself. That, or they don't have any spine. And I would like to say that about Priti Patel.
Yeah. So, even if Boris Johnson isn't the most conservative at this point, he's laying the foundations for what could be a much more conservative government in the future, would you say? If someone like Priti Patel or, Dominic Raab were to become Prime Minister, perhaps, something like this.
I don't think Boris Johnson is laying the ground for a more right-wing Conservative government in the future. I think, if anything, he is laying the ground for a more left-wing Conservative government into the future, or a moderate Labour Party. If you consider what he is suggesting, levelling up the North, for example, and possibly reinvigorating manufacturing in regards to medicine, I would say all of these things point towards economic nationalism and a mild form of social democracy. And I think that's only ceding yet more ground to the left. And as a result, reaffirming the arguments that they're already making in regards to nationalisation, price controls, tariffs, etc.
Well, going back to the broader argument of the Conservatives in general, the way I square what we were just saying earlier is I kind of feel exactly the same as you, that the Conservative Party is the best vehicle for conservative values. And the way I always associate it is with the Republican Party and Donald Trump. Before Donald Trump, the Republican Party is not what it is today. And Donald Trump came in and has totally transformed the Republican Party in such a way that the base of the Republican Party now is much more conservative than it used to be. And so I see the Conservatives as very much on the same path. If we can continue to get inspiring conservative people into the Conservative Party, we can push it more in that direction.
I don't think Trump has made the Republicans more conservative. He's done some good stuff, such as the tax cuts and Jobs Act, but I think he's made them more nationalistic in a bad way. His tariffs are probably the best example of this, and the trade war he has created with China.
So are your main gripes economical ones?
Are my main gripes economic? They're my primary concerns, certainly. But I don't think even in regards to social policy, Trump has made the Republicans particularly conservative compared to how they used to be. I mean, he's not a particularly conservative character either. But
he has recently banned all immigration. I know it was due to coronavirus, but it's still quite a step to take.
Well, I suppose that would be the case. I'll be honest with you, I don't really follow US politics that much. But if we are to take examples from US politics, I'd say the Tea Party is probably a better example of how the Republicans can be infiltrated by people who are truer to an American conservative ideology. I mean, I will make listeners aware that I don't really believe there is that coherent a conservative ideology at all. There is Roger Scruton, but even he makes rather convoluted arguments as far as I'm concerned. There is nothing concrete to conservatism. It's a broad set of attitudes and possibly ways of living, but I don't think it's very concrete in regards to its political precepts.
Well, I agree, actually, and I agree especially because I actually don't associate conservatism particularly with free market capitalism. I think, to me, that's more of a recent phenomenon. And I am broadly supportive of free market capitalism, but I do think there are some circumstances in which I would support state support, including the NHS. Obviously including things like the military and the police as well. Are you quite radical in your libertarianism? Do you think everything should be independent of the state?
I'm firmly of the belief everything should be privatized. But you say that's not a entirely conservative position. Before Robert Peel set up the Metropolitan Police in 1828, there was no state police force. There was an army, but there was no state police force. And conservatives believed that that should be the case, presumably before Peel implemented that act of Parliament as Home Secretary, I believe it was. So conservatives have believed in a great number of things that libertarians believe currently, simply as a fact of the age in which they lived. I mean, they didn't favour the NHS in the 1700s. They didn't favour a state police force. They didn't favour state education. I mean, state funding for education didn't begin until about 1832, I believe it is. And it took until 1870 before there was an act that made it compulsory.
I guess if you go really back in history, you can go to a time when it was very much independent of the state, the economy. But let's talk about local politics. Okay. Let's talk about local politics, because I think this is a very important subject, which I think you're very astute at. A lot of people like to talk about politics, especially on the internet, but not a whole load of people are getting involved locally in their conservative constituencies, you know, doing the groundwork, whether it be delivering leaflets and...
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
I don't have it with me. Could you close the door, Mum? Could you close the door, please? Excuse me for a moment.
Don't worry, it's happened to the best of us.
At least I don't have to pay rent.
Yeah, tell me about it. Yeah, so local politics. A lot of people talk a lot about politics on the internet, but not a lot of people are doing the groundwork in local politics like you are. How did you first get involved in your Conservative constituency? You know, how will they receive you, and what was it like?
So I first met my current councillor colleagues as a result of holding a stall with the Taxpayers Alliance. I was out in East Grinstead High Street giving out leaflets with them, calling for lower taxes, criticising the town council for spending more money on Christmas lights and the mayor's allowance and the councillors' allowances. And I believe I ended up giving a leaflet to a councillor, or one of my colleagues gave a leaflet to a councillor. And I think they realised at some point I was a member of the Conservative Party. So a good friend of mine now, Norman Webster, called me in to meet the leader of the town council. And I thought at the time I was being told off by him when he said, "Oh, you've got to come and talk to the leader of the town council." But when I got to the meeting, I very quickly realised that that friend of mine, Norman Webster, was you perhaps using me as a tool to criticise the group leader for what he probably saw, I can't say for certain, as excess expenditure. So I argued with the group leader of the council, Dick Sweatman, and I said, "Look, we can't be spending all this money on Christmas lights. If people want Christmas lights, they can pay for Christmas lights. Why should the mayor's allowance be so high, etc., etc.?" And as a result of seeing them, I got involved with the association more. I identified myself with the right wing of the association, who are predominantly in Haywards Heath and Burgess Hill. Not many right-wing people are in East Grinstead. And I suppose from there, I just thought, well, I could actually get a council seat. And I put myself forward twice, once in a by-election when I was 18, to be selected as the Conservative candidate. That is, I failed as a result of a now colleague of mine being selected instead. I then put myself forward again, and two other candidates beat me to it. I then put myself forward at the 2019 local elections selection, and I got selected then. And I'll be honest with listeners and viewers, I got selected as a result of nobody else standing against me. And I can say that with absolute certainty, because the chairman said, I've had people on the phone saying, "Do not select Charles Amos. He must not be selected. He will be a paid off if he is selected." But because they had nobody else to select, I was selected by default.
So do you find yourself at odds even in your local association?
100%. 100%.
So what makes you so determined then?
I am determined to implement my ideology, which is libertarianism, which I think is closer to a conservative ideology than what my conservative colleagues put forward. As far as I'm concerned, they put forward social democracy, which is predicated on collectivism, whilst I'd much rather see an individualist ideology put forward instead. And I am determined, because if I can't move things along at this level, the chances of me being able to move politics along at a national or regional level, they're even more limited. So I've got to attempt to move things along here in East Grinstead.
And that's the way you do change things fundamentally, isn't it? You start at a local level, then you build your way up, and then hopefully, you know, you get lucky enough to get a position as an MP.
I really would encourage all of your viewers to get involved in their local Conservative associations, because particularly if they're in a Conservative dominated area, as I am here in Mid Sussex, there is a very good chance that at town council and parish council level that they'll be selected simply because there is nobody else to select. I mean, that really is the case in large areas of the country. They simply don't have enough activists and willing members to be put on these small-time councils.
Yeah. And now you have your most recent position, which is president of KCL. I suppose you've only been in the post for a short amount of time, so you haven't really had the chance to do that much as of yet. But can you speak of any experience in this position so far?
Obviously, we've had this very large reaction on Twitter to the posts we put out recently. We put out 6 posts, one for each committee member: the president, the treasurer, the vice president, the general secretary, and the editor of the 1828 journal, which I would encourage all readers to, or viewers rather, to visit. And unbeknown to us, we had all uploaded pictures of ourselves in suits or formal dress, and Twitter noticed that. We didn't think it was something really to notice, and as a result they called us out as being satirical characters because we were all dressed shirt or tie and we all looked like stereotypical Tories. And to be honest, I think we probably do look, actually not we probably do, we do look like stereotypical Tories or young Tories. When people think of young Tories, they probably do think of somebody such as you or I, dressed in a suit and tie, going about preaching lower taxes and public spending cuts.
It does seem, though, you kind of embrace this image, though, very much from, you know, your video that you did advertising yourself as president. Is this something you're conscious of, the way you dress yourself and everything?
I am conscious of it, but I don't go out of my way to dress like this because it appeals to a certain audience. It certainly helps in getting noticed and boosting views, but I dress like this whenever I go to university, for example. And all of my fellow student colleagues will attest to that. When I go to university, I go up there in my Nigel Farage jacket and my fedora, all with a tie on. I think there's one instance when I haven't gone to university in a tie. So it's not a fake character, as some people suggest.
It does seem like there's something rebellious about it in this day and age, though. Just wearing a suit and looking proper. It's kind of almost like an FU to the social norms of the time, you know, and there's something to admire about that, I think.
I mean, I always pull a face when the lecturer comes in to give a lecture at university when they're in track suits and trainers or something rather like that. I think we're at university, we're in an institution of higher education, and I'm dressed better than you. Please, at least put on a collared shirt and jacket. I'm not asking for a tie, but a collared shirt and jacket. I don't want to see you in a t-shirt.
Well, I did a little bit of research. I did a little bit of research into UCL, and I saw that some of the students which went there in the past were G.K. Chesterton and Sir Alexandra Graham Bell. So you've had a lot of prestigious students go to that university.
It's King's College London that I go to, but I am familiar with University College London. Oh,
sorry. No, sorry. I meant King's College London, I think. Unless I got a mistaken there.
I'm not aware of the totality of the alumni at King, so I wouldn't know.
But it's a big university, isn't it?
Yes, 32,000 students at it currently.
Yeah, so it's one of the bigger ones. So did you get a lot of backlash from people in your university, or was it just more hyped on Twitter and things like this.
Oh, yes. One of the interesting things about my election is that it was announced on March the 26th, but I only appointed my committee a couple of days ago. And it was only when we made the committee announcements that this Twitter storm erupted. So I haven't seen any of my colleagues in person, and so I don't know what their reaction has been to my election. I've only seen what's been on Twitter, which has been amusing in places and rather rude in others.
So what's the rest of the people like in your conservative society? Are they kind of like you in their views and how they are?
No, most people are not like me in their views. Most people, I would say, are of a one nation character, believing that the state must tax the rich to a greater degree than the poor, to redistribute income and ensure that public services such as education are provided by the state. People are not as radical as me.
If you were to align them with any particular conservative politician, who would it be? Most of the people in your society?
Most of my people in the society, in the association, are foreign and European. So I would probably go with somebody like Kenneth Clarke.
Kenneth Clarke.
Kenneth Clarke. I mean, it's very hard to say, since most of them are European and therefore, well, not necessarily therefore, but most probably in favour of the European Union. I would say Kenneth Clarke is an approximate representation of their views.
So most of the people in your conservative society are supportive of the European Union. That's what you're saying?
To be quite honest with you, I really don't know. But given that a great number of them are international, I would say probably yes.
That's quite a sad state of affairs, really, isn't it?
I don't know. I really don't know. I can certainly say that most of the people that I mix with socially are against the European Union.
Yeah. Okay. Shall I fire some questions at you then from our viewers?
Please go ahead.
I'll go on the Facebook first. So I have a few here from Zach Bosley. He's been on our show before.
Yep.
He asks, how will the social and economic impacts of the coronavirus lockdown affect politics in the future, in your opinion?
I am firmly of the belief that this lockdown will lead to more collectivistic politics. That is, the dominant ideology which shall prevail in political discourse will be one of collectivism. Simply because people are using the word community far too often. It's encouraged people to be less individualistic in their political attitudes than they otherwise would have been. And it's also demonstrated that the state can operate on a mass scale throughout the economy, and some people will see that as being a good thing. I don't think the state has done anything good for the economy as a result of the lockdown, but some people will see that the NHS is capable, in a very poor way as far as I'm concerned, of delivering tests and they'll extrapolate from that and say, well, therefore the state can deliver this and the state can deliver that, when in actual fact the state is institutionally incapable of being efficient due to the lack of competition.
So what, in your opinion, needs to be done to lower government spending and reduce the national debt? That's again from Zach.
I think we could start off by abolishing the Department for Culture, Media and Sport. That costs about £1.8 billion. We could get rid of HS2, scrap that entirely. That would save over £100 billion over many, many years. But ultimately, and I have thought about this question, we've got to win the argument for privatisation. The state is not going to be made smaller unless either health or education can be privatised.
Right.
Not to work on the case for privatising those. And I think you can make very convincing case for both of those sectors to be entirely privatised.
Would you advocate for a model perhaps like Germany? I know they're often referred to as a good example of a private health service.
I would
is it France or Germany? One of the two.
I mean, I'm not aware of all of the details, but I am aware of the fact that the Netherlands does substantially better in cancer care than we do. If you look at the top 5 cancers in the UK, the survival rate is higher in both the USA and the Netherlands. So I would favour a system which is substantially more private in its nature. In fact, I'll go the whole hog. I favour an entirely private healthcare system.
Right. Okay. A lot of people would say against that, though. They'd say, "Oh, what about America, where people die on the street and things like that?" I know a lot of it is exaggerated, but what makes a good system, which doesn't become too costly, perhaps like America?
The system must be voluntary. I'm not of the belief that taxation should be used to support some people's healthcare at all. And as a result, I would favour private healthcare irrespective of the results. But I happen to believe, and economics tends to demonstrate, that the more competition you have in any industry, the better the results are.
Okay. I've got another question here. How important is demographics? And just to go over some more on this one, it says, to you, what are British values? And he also says, is tolerance and diversity a British value?
So the first question was,
how important is demographics?
I don't think demographics per se are important. And I know that this is a question to test my cultural sound.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm very much of the belief that one should adopt Hans Hermann Hopp's argument in regards to immigration. That being, private institutions should determine the level of immigration that is allowed into this country, and that typically those private institutions would allow for less immigration into this country. So I don't have an issue with demographics per se, but I think a entirely privatized system of government would allow for substantially reduced levels of immigration. And I personally
do you not think corporations would advocate for more mass immigration, particularly because it pushes down how much they have to pay for wages?
Some corporations may advocate more immigration, but homeowners associations may say, we're not taking these immigrants, and therefore the corporations have nowhere to house these immigrants. And since ideally all public property would be privatized, there would be nowhere for them to go. And since the corporation would not invite immigrants into the country where they had nowhere to go, they would not be able to invite the immigrants unless they were able to provide accommodation with a landlord or through other means.
What about in a situation where, a company would choose to, I mean, there were cases in the past where they found out companies were advertising in places like Romania and not in Britain because they wanted the Romanians. How do you feel about that, for instance?
At the moment, I have an issue with immigration because it puts a strain on public services. The debate as to whether or not immigrants contribute to GDP, I think, is fairly settled. They do contribute to GDP. The fiscal question is more complicated, and I happen to land on the side of the debate that says immigrants cost the UK government money, and therefore corporations inviting immigrants into the UK does present issues because it's burdening taxpayers with paying for their welfare and social support. So I would be against the kind of immigration that we see currently, and that's why I'd like to see it reduce substantially, and I'd like to see primarily the high skill individuals coming into the UK. But that's a second, third best alternative that I hold at the moment because I can't have my ideal.
And to the question on British values and tolerance and diversity.
What are British values?
Yeah, that old chestnut.
I do think tolerance is in there, but I
Right.
don't think that means tolerance towards everybody, everything.
Yeah.
I think Britons are quite right in being intolerant of halal meat. I mean, it irritates the left even, because they're thinking, oh, animal rights on the one hand versus not offending a minority group. It's very hard to pin down British values. I think you've really got to associate them with a certain period of time. And if I were to associate British values with any period of time, I'd probably associate British values with Victorian values. So the stiffer upper lip, the conservative nature that is not being too promiscuous, for example.
Fair play and things like that.
Fair play, I think would certainly fit into Britain's characteristics. But I think you've got to be careful you don't just attribute everything that is good to being British. Now, although I think a great number of things can be attributed to the British that are good, I don't think you should attribute everything that is good to the British. You've got to produce some characteristics that actually differentiate us from other nationalities to enable British values to mean anything, or British characteristics to mean anything. Because I can't imagine people saying they're against fair pay if they're from America or Spain or France or Iraq or Iran, etc.
Yeah. Do you think free speech is a British value?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Ever since the 1689 Bill of Rights, I'd say free speech has been a fundamental value within Britain's institutions. I do think it is under threat, though.
So
I do think it is under threat.
you don't think it's under threat?
No, I do think it's under threat. I do think it's under threat.
Think it's under threat, yeah.
I was informed by my town clerk recently, who governs the town council and essentially runs it when the councillors aren't there. And she said that one member of the audience at a council meeting almost had to be stopped in speaking because she thought that he was going to say something racist. Now, I'm not in favour of people making racist comments, but if people want to come along and make racist comments at a meeting, then I think they have every right to do so. I'll disagree with them making those comments, but if they want to come along and make such comments, then I don't see why the state should say, no, you can't say that here. In a public forum, and a council chamber is a public forum, people should be able to say whatever they like.
Yeah. I've got some other questions here. There's one about, how important is homosexuality, do you think, to Conservatives? I know we spoke about conservative values. Where do you stand on positions like that? For instance, gay marriage. How do you feel of gay marriage? David Cameron obviously famously legalized gay marriage. Do you think that was a good decision?
No.
Right.
I don't think it was a good decision because, as a libertarian, I'm against the state intervening in... Well, let me start again. The state should not be involved in marriage at all. And insofar as gay marriage is an intervention in private contracts between parties and a violation of the Church of England's precepts in regards to marriage, I don't think gay marriage should have been passed by the state. Now, I do understand the state and the church in the UK are the same thing. Yeah. The Queen is the head of the church and is also head of the state. But I don't believe that should mean that the state can say this is marriage, that is marriage. The church should define what marriage is and not the state, not legislators, not MPs, not peers. The state should stay out of marriage, and therefore it should have stayed out the gay marriage debate. I've no issue with civil partnerships, for example. I've no issue with homosexuality per se, but for the reasons I've just mentioned, I don't believe the state should be involved in marriage at all.
Yeah, I agree. And you don't have to have a particular view on homosexuality, I think, to believe that like you say, the government should not be involved in the question of marriage because it's not their remit, really. It's the
church
remit
the
of the church. Yeah, exactly. Okay, let's see if I can find any other good questions. I have one question here saying, does John Major get royalties from the glasses you're wearing?
No, I wouldn't pay a penny for that man, not if I was forced to.
Are you not in favour of John Major?
I can't stand John Major, no.
Okay, I've got one here from Alistair Jeffreys. Why does the Conservative Party continue to be pro-immigration despite the wishes of their voters? And will the Conservatives even become a party that's serious about tackling immigration? For example, will they ever bring it below 100,000 a year as they keep claiming they will? I know we touched on this previously. Maybe you could elaborate a little bit.
I think it's an interesting question. Ultimately, the Conservative Parliamentary Party is made up of a number of university graduates, and university graduates of a certain class of people. And as a result of coming from that certain class of people, and as a result of being in the university environment, I think they're always going to be in favour of more immigration, because the social environment in which they've grown up disapproves of people being against immigration. And I also think they haven't necessarily felt the effects of mass immigration, because they haven't typically been in those areas that have been affected by it heavily. And I think on the whole, the progressives have got a stranglehold on the Conservative Party. I don't think socially conservative MPs are likely to regain the reins of the Conservative Party. And even if they did, although the population would support them on the immigration issue, they would hate them so much on virtually every other issue on which they stood, that they very quickly throw them out and wish for the progressive Conservatives back, who are typically more in line with the electorate's views on economic policy.
And it actually said in your article that you think young people need to understand how immigration affects them negatively. I know it wasn't quite in those words, but how do you think we can get young people to understand the negative effects of immigration?
I'm not so sure of the comments that I made about young people having to understand the effects of immigration. I said that
mass migration in particular.
I said it cost them jobs. UKIP wouldn't gain support until they realised that it cost them jobs. And I don't know whether or not that's a factually true statement. Personally, I'm not against immigration for economic reasons. I'm against immigrations because it infringes on people's liberty and it forces integration onto the population. So I don't think we should really be using economic arguments against immigration at all. I mean, it assumes, to start off with, that maximising GDP is the goal of everything. And as Nigel Farage has said in the past, maximising GDP should never be the goal of all government policy.
But surely you believe that you can make the argument that it pushes down wages when you have a lot of low-skilled immigrants come into the country. I think that's quite a compelling argument.
That argument can be used, but equally well, if a great number of people came down from the north of England to the south, that would also suppress wages. And none of us would argue for internal migration barriers between the north and the south, even if it did. So I don't think it's an argument that we should be using for that reason, that it can be extrapolated to become an absurdity. I think we've got to make a cultural argument against immigration or a fiscal argument against immigration. Yes, a fiscal argument. I think you can say we shouldn't allow for immigration in the numbers that we've currently seen, because it puts a strain on public services and therefore taxpayers to pay off bills. I mean, if immigrants are coming into this country, and some of them certainly do, and they cost the state a great deal of money and they contribute very little in tax, then that is the British public having to pay off that debt at some point in the future. And I don't think we should be importing people who impose levels of debt such as that onto the population. So I think that's an argument we can make.
And you said you'd argue from the cultural position as well. So would that align perhaps with saying you only want people who are more likely to integrate into the country and associate with our values? Do you mean from that perspective?
I don't think the state should discriminate between immigrants at the moment. If private institutions wish to do so into the future, then I have no issue with that, because you don't want to see cultural conflicts and clashes of beliefs into the future. It isn't healthy for a population, and Hop makes very sound arguments in this regard. Yes, you don't want to see huge clashes of cultural values.
Okay. I'm going to try and get through some of these YouTube questions. There's quite a lot, so you might have to bear with me. I'll get through a fair few. I'll try and pick the best ones. If anyone wants to post any questions now, please do.
I'm albino with this light.
It is quite a strong light.
I'll turn it off. Yeah, I expect it to be dark otherwise, though. Oh, that's a bit more normal, isn't it?
Yeah. Someone here says the Irish are set to become a minority in Ireland by 2050. Now, I have no idea what that is based on. But he says, what do you think about that?
I would be uncomfortable with that if I were Irish. I mean, people will say, particularly those of a progressive nature, that you should have no issue with the native population becoming a minority. And even people like Dan Hannan say, oh, I would have no issue with that. But I think deep down in their hearts, they do have an issue with that. I mean, I cannot imagine that Angolans would be entirely happy if their population was totally overwhelmed by white colonialists. They wouldn't be happy with that. They'd be, this is not the country that I've grown up in the past, and I don't like it. And I don't think there's anything wrong with British people thinking in the same way. And anybody that says otherwise and says I'd quite happily be a minority in my own country, I think is not telling the entire truth.
There's quite a few people saying that they've heard that apparently we are set to become a minority ourselves in 2066 as well. My guess would be these statistics are probably based on if immigration trends were to continue from, you know, the David Cameron era up till 2066. I have a feeling that immigration is probably more likely to come down at least a good amount before we hit the levels of being a minority. So I can't see it being that quick, personally.
As countries develop and become richer, there will be less migration within the world because people will be quite happy in the countries in which they were born.
Yeah.
Romanians could get the same wages that they get in this country in Romania. They wouldn't leave Romania.
Yeah, and that is changing as well. A lot of people are finding more opportunity now in places like Eastern Europe, and we're not getting quite the same waves as we used to now. However, we do still get a lot of migration, I think, from places like Pakistan. And, you know, that's when the question becomes difficult, because as much as, you know, I would like a situation to improve in Pakistan, I don't see it becoming an economic powerhouse anytime soon, you know.
Yeah, that's quite true. Some places in the world have got quite a lot to catch up on.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm just sifting through a lot of these questions. A lot of them are quite similar, to be honest. I guess the main concern, I guess, with most people I'm seeing here is the question of immigration and demographics. and I can see why that is. And you've seen recently that there have been political parties spring up, like For Britain and Patriotic Alliance. What do you think of those movements and what they're trying to do?
I think on the whole, they have a very ill thought out set of arguments against immigration, because it's not rooted in any ideology. As a libertarian, particularly a Austro-libertarian, you can object to immigration on the grounds that the state is illegitimate, and therefore the state allowing for integration, forced integration, is also illegitimate. It ought to be up to private property owners to decide who they associate with and who they don't associate with. Now, if that means that those on the left wish to associate with a multicultural community on a private property of their choice, then so be it. But if certain other individuals wish to form a more homogenous community ethnically, then that is their prerogative. And I see no reason why the state should involve itself violently in the affairs of such individuals. It ought to be up to the individual and associations of individuals to determine who they associate with and who they don't associate with.
So with these people who have become involved in parties like For Britain, or are thinking of getting involved, what would be your argument to them as far as people who are concerned with immigration, basically? What would your argument be to them that they'd be better off putting their energy in the Conservative Party instead than perhaps someone like For Britain?
My advice to those people would be read Hans Hermann Hoppe. Hans Hermann Hoppe makes a very convincing case for libertarianism with restricted immigration, which he says are the only two consistent positions for a libertarian to hold. Well, of course, a libertarian has to be consistent with libertarianism, but he makes very clear that if you are a libertarian, you must also believe in restricted immigration or controlled immigration in some way. I would urge everybody to go and read him. He makes some very sound arguments. And then I would urge members or your viewers to join the Conservative Party and get involved in local politics and try to persuade people round to their position. But in all honesty, I would say that most members of my local Conservative association probably do adopt a UKIP position on immigration. I think the Conservative Party as a whole, in terms of its membership, is actually very UKIP in regards to its position on immigration. The issue is the parliamentary party in CCHQ. And the type of people that want to become MPs typically are of a more socially conservative nature, and therefore we need more individuals of a socially conservative nature to put themselves forward as parliamentary candidates to sway the parliamentary party to restricting immigration. But in saying that, I'd say ultimately we need to sway the intellectual class towards a position of more restricted immigration, because it's only once we've persuaded the type of people that go to university, the liberal elite, so to speak, that the individuals who occupy the civil service and government into the future will actually implement what the majority of people want, which is restricted immigration. So you've got to make an intellectual argument against it, and you've got to make a sound intellectual argument against it. Hans Hermann Hoppe provides that argument. And then you've got to make sure you infiltrate the higher echelons of the Conservative Party at a parliamentary level in particular.
Yeah, I totally agree. Perhaps wouldn't use the word infiltrate, maybe, because that sounds like some kind of espionage. But
recapture is a better word, perhaps. Recapture.
Yeah, recapture conservative values.
We're not supposed to be there, when in actual fact we are the ones who are more conservative than the progressives that currently run the Conservative Party are.
Yeah, I often emphasize the point which you made, which is that the Conservative Party membership is actually a lot more conservative than people give credit for. I don't think the parliamentary side of the Conservative Party fully represents where the Conservative members are politically. And
100%. Conservative members, certainly on immigration, are far more UKIP-y than the parliamentary party is.
Yeah.
I can't think of a better word than UKIP-y, but I think most viewers would understand what I mean when I say that.
Well, I would just say conservative, much more conservative.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. We've gone on for just over an hour, so I think we'll end the stream there.
Excellent. Thank you very much for having me on the show. I really do appreciate it.
Definitely, it's great to have you on. Do you have any things people can follow you on, whether it be Twitter or anything like that?
I'm afraid I only have Facebook, but I would urge viewers to follow the King's College London Conservative Association Twitter account and our Instagram, because we should be putting out some interesting stuff in the following months and years.
Are you going to shake things up a bit around the university?
Absolutely. We intend to hold a number of inter-party debates, a number of black tie dinners with interesting speakers. And if anybody is in London, they're more than welcome to come along to these events, as long as they register before the event starts. And yes, we certainly do intend to dominate the university campus and ensure that the position for liberty is put forward as staunchly as possible.
Great stuff. Okay, thanks for coming on the show.
Excellent. Have a good evening, sir. Thank you.
Good evening to you.